What if the first civilization was not found because we have been looking on the wrong surface of the planet? Most of us imagine history beginning on dry land. Villages, farms, cities, writing and monuments rise step by step from the soil, and the oldest pages of the human story seem to lie buried in deserts or under ancient mounds. That picture is not foolish. The evidence for it is strong, visible, and carefully excavated. But strong evidence is not the same thing as the whole story. The ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth. For most of human memory, it has been treated as empty space between the continents, a blue backdrop for the real stage of civilization. But the ocean is not empty. It is a cold, dark, pressurized archive, and it may hold the missing beginning of everything we call history. In the early 2000s, a survey team scanning the seabed off western Cuba reported something that did not fit the usual picture. The sonar returns showed shapes more than 600 meters below the surface. Not scattered rocks or natural ridges, but block-like forms, long straight lines, and a scale that made the ocean floor feel planned. The depth alone was startling. At 600 meters down, the water presses with a weight that makes human exploration slow, expensive, and rare. Light does not reach that far. The shapes sat in permanent night, and they looked like geometry that should not be there. The team described rectangular structures, wide avenues, and symmetrical arrangements stretching across the sonar screen. The images were grainy, the resolution limited by the equipment of the time, but the patterns were sharp enough to stop a trained eye. One researcher later called them too regular for geology, too large for a shipwreck, and too deep for any known human settlement. The formations seemed to rise from a time when that part of the seabed was not seabed at all. If the shapes are real enough to bother the eye, they create an immediate problem. Land that now lies under more than 600 meters of water was last exposed tens of thousands of years ago, long before the first cities, before the first farms, before the familiar ladder of civilization was supposed to have any rungs at all. A shallow ruin is an archaeological question. A deep ruin becomes a time machine, pulling the whole timeline downward into the abyss. The ocean is not a passive container. It is a moving, erasing, preserving force. It can swallow a coastline over centuries or drown a plain in a single remembered wave. It can hide a city so completely that only old texts keep its name alive, and then, centuries later, return a stone face to the light. The Cuban anomaly may be one such hidden page, suspended in darkness, waiting for machines and money and political will to read it. But the mystery does not rest on a single sonar pattern. The deeper question is larger and harder to ignore. What if the oldest chapter of human life is not buried under desert sands, but drowned under the seas that rose after the last ice age? What if the shorelines we know are only the last version of the map? What if flood myths, found in culture after culture, are not just stories, but memories of real land going under? And what if the first page of civilization is still under the water, unread and unnamed? This film is not a hunt for one lost city. It is a journey through drowned landscapes, underwater anomalies, survivor monuments on land, old texts, and flood memories that refuse to fade. It begins with a strange pattern on a dark seabed and moves outward, across flooded plains, broken continents, carved stone hills, and myths that carry older echoes than we usually admit. The familiar picture of history is not wrong. It is simply too dry. If this mystery pulls you in, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. If the ocean can hide one strange pattern, what else disappeared when the shorelines moved? The ocean is not empty. That is the first thought this film asks you to hold. A strange pattern sits in the dark off western Cuba, and if it is what some think it might be, the timeline of civilization becomes a question mark. But one anomaly is not enough to redraw the map, so we will follow the water further. We will start deep with that sonar geometry. Then we will rise to the continental shelves, to the drowned plains where the sea swallowed whole countries. We will stand at the edge of the last ice age, when the sea was 120 meters lower, and see the exposed shelves that are now underwater. We will walk on land to a monument that feels like a memory from the drowned age. And finally, we will listen to the old stories that still carry the names of the flood. The next trace will not be another deep shape. It will be a flat plain now under the North Sea, a country without a name, Doggerland. There, fishing nets still pull up mammoth bone and stone tools. Then we will move to the tropical world, to Sundaland, where a vast shelf broke into the islands of Southeast Asia. After the water, we will find a hill in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, a place of carved pillars and animal reliefs that predates cities and farming. It stands like a memorial at the edge of the Drowned Age. Later, we will descend to a confirmed drowned city, Thonis-Heracleion, where statues and inscriptions lay in the dark for centuries until divers touched the stone. And finally, we will turn to the old texts, to Plato's Atlantis with its strange old date, and to the flood stories that echo across Mesopotamia, India, and Greece. These stories may be the oldest memory of land turning into water. These are not separate puzzles, they are links in a chain. One discovery leads to the next, and the whole chain asks the same question. What was erased when the sea rose? The first map of civilization may have been drawn on coastlines that no longer exist. If this mystery pulls you in, like, subscribe, and tell us where you are watching from. If the best human land was coastal, why does our oldest history look so inland? If the oldest history looks inland, perhaps that is because the missing piece was never inland at all. In the early 2000s, a survey team was mapping the seabed off the western tip of Cuba. They were not looking for ruins. They were using side-scan sonar to read the floor of the Yucatan Channel, a deep passage between the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. What appeared on their screens stopped the routine work. The sonar returns described shapes that did not fit an ordinary seabed. Block-like forms, long straight lines, what looked like a grid pattern spread across a wide area. The geometry was not a single odd rock. It was a complex of angles and alignments that felt, even to trained eyes, too regular for nature's usual scatter. The depth was over 600 meters, more than a third of a mile beneath the surface. At that depth, sunlight does not reach. The water is cold and crushing, and that depth is what makes the shape so troubling for the simple story of human history. A shallow ruin is an archaeological question. A deep ruin becomes a time machine, because land that sits 600 meters down could not have been above water in any recent epoch. Sea levels have risen and fallen over the ages, but the last time the shore was that far out would be far older than any accepted civilization. If the shapes are not natural, they belong to a world that predates the timeline we were taught. The team that found them, led by Paulina Zalitsky and Paul Weinsweig, described the site with careful words: an anomaly, a possible complex of structures. But the images were never fully resolved. The depth made follow-up work extraordinarily expensive and difficult. Remotely operated vehicles could go down, but visibility was poor, the current strong, and the political situation around Cuba added another layer of complication. So the anomaly stayed suspended in the dark, a ghost on the sonar records. And that suspension is part of the story. The ocean does not open its archive easily. A site this deep cannot be casually checked. It demands machines, money, time, and cooperation that rarely align. So the shapes remain a question that has never been answered, only deepened by the years. This is the first object that pulls the familiar timeline downward. Not a broken pot in a desert trench, but a pattern of right angles in a place where they should not exist. It is not proof. It is a pressure mark. It suggests that the surface we call history may be sitting on top of a much older layer hidden by the weight of the sea. If the shapes are real enough to bother the eye, what would their depth do to the timeline? 600 meters down. That is where the shapes off western Cuba sit, far below any place a human being could have stood in the last few thousand years. And depth is not just a number. In the story of the sea, depth is time. When the planet was much colder, enormous sheets of ice locked up so much water that the oceans were lower, not by a few meters, by a distance that would make a modern shoreline feel like a ladder that climbed far outward. The coast was not where it is today. It was miles beyond the present edge, on land that is now a dark shelf under deep water. That means the depth of the Cuban anomaly is not only a problem of access, it is a problem of timeline. If the shapes at that depth are not a trick of sonar or a strange volcanic fracture, they belong to an age that pushes the familiar story of human building much further back than the textbooks allow. The sea rose slowly, then faster, as the ice gave way. It climbed across coastal plains, drowned river valleys, and covered campsites, gathering places, and maybe whole settlements. What the sonar saw off Cuba may not be a single lost city. It may be a fragment of a much larger pattern, a pattern that repeated itself on every continent where the water swallowed the best land first. But here is the hard part. Checking a shape at 600 meters is not like digging a trench in a desert. The pressure at that depth is crushing. The darkness is absolute. Sending down a submersible costs millions of dollars. It requires specialized ships, trained crews, and permission from governments that may not want to open a question they cannot easily answer. The site sits in a part of the world where politics and logistics slow everything down, so the mystery does not get solved quickly. It gets suspended. A shallow ruin is an archaeological question. A deep ruin becomes a time machine. And time machines are expensive to operate. The ocean can hold a question for decades, not because it is hiding the answer, but because the answer is simply hard to reach. The water is heavy, the sediment is thick, the money is scarce, and the will to look must compete with 1,000 other needs on land. But if the Cuban anomaly is one piece of a drowned world, then the real archive is not a single formation. It is the continental shelves themselves, the wide, flat shoulders of the continents that were exposed for tens of thousands of years and are now covered by the sea. Those shelves were the old coastal plains. They were where rivers met the ocean, where food was richest, where the first routes of human movement probably ran, and almost none of them have been properly searched. What if the real archive is not one formation, but the continental shelves themselves? About 120 meters. That is roughly how much lower the sea sat during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets locked up so much water that the global shoreline pulled far beyond the modern coast. The number itself is quiet and precise, but the world it reveals is not. Lower sea levels turned the continental shelves into dry land. Shallow seabeds that today lie under dozens of meters of water were once plains, hills, river valleys, lakes, and coastal ridges. The North Sea was not a sea at all. It was a rolling landscape connecting Britain to Europe, crisscrossed by rivers and dotted with marshes. Southeast Asia held a much larger landmass than the scatter of islands we now call Indonesia. The shelves off India, Australia, the Americas, Africa, and the Mediterranean all wore a different face. The map we learned in school was only the most recent version, and the change was not a single dramatic event. It unfolded over thousands of years, with pulses of meltwater and long quiet intervals. People living through it would not have woken up one morning to find the ocean at their door. They would have noticed the shoreline moving season by season, the salt creeping into fresh water, the old campsites becoming tidal, then disappearing entirely. The land did not vanish into myth. A large part of it became seabed. What makes this shift important for the human story is where people tended to live. Coastlines offered food in dense, reliable forms: fish, shellfish, water birds, sea mammals, and plants that grew where fresh and salt water mixed. They offered movement, because a coastline is a natural corridor. They offered fresh water where rivers met the sea, and they offered a temperate, life-rich edge between two worlds. For early communities, the shore was not a margin. It was often the centre. When the ice melted, the ocean reclaimed that centre. The very places that had supported the largest gatherings, the richest diets, and the easiest travel became the first to go under. The mechanism is not a fantasy. It is not a hidden catastrophe requiring a lost technology or a secret continent. It is simply the planet breathing in and out over deep time and the water rising over the best human land. So the question is not whether the ocean could have erased ancient human landscapes. It is how much it erased, where, and whether any memory of those drowned places survived on land. The shelves were real, they were exposed for tens of thousands of years, and they were habitable. That means the archive of early human life is not only under the soil of known archaeological sites. A large part of it rests under mud, silt, and salt water, waiting for a different kind of reading. If the shelves were land, who lived there before the water returned? In the cold grey light of a North Sea morning, a fishing trawler hauled its nets and found something that should not have been there. Among the dark mass of cod and haddock lay a long curved bone, heavy and dark, not from any fish. It was the tusk of a mammoth, pulled from the seabed 40 miles from the nearest shore. The fishermen did not know it then, but they had just caught a piece of a lost country. A country without a name, without a flag, without a single surviving house. A country that now lies under salt water, its hills flattened into sandbanks, its rivers buried beneath the silt, its forests reduced to dark compressed layers that sometimes still surface in a trawler's net. That lost country is called Doggerland, and it was not a myth, it was a real, inhabited landscape. Imagine standing on the east coast of England today and looking out over the grey water. Now imagine the water gone, pulled back by an ice age that locked so much of the planet's moisture into glaciers that the sea level dropped by more than 120 metres. Where the North Sea now rolls, a wide plain stretched from Britain to the continent. It was cold, open country, cut by slow rivers and dotted with marshes, birchwoods, and grazing grounds for herds of mammoth, horse, and reindeer. And people lived there. We know this because the nets keep bringing pieces of it back. Fishermen have pulled up mammoth bones, antler tools, worked flints, and even a fragment of a human skull. In the 1930s, a trawler brought up a barbed harpoon made from antler, beautifully preserved, a weapon that once flew from a hunter's hand on a plain now buried under dozens of meters of water. These are not random curiosities. They are the material traces of a human world that the sea swallowed. The science is not disputed. Geologists and archaeologists have mapped Doggerland's contours using seismic surveys and sediment cores. They have found the courses of ancient rivers, the outlines of former lakes, the slopes of hills that are now submerged banks. The evidence is clear. Between roughly 10,000 and 8,000 years ago, this was a place where families camped, hunted, fished, and moved with the seasons. It was not a barren land bridge. It was a homeland. The North Sea was once a country without a name, and the nets still bring pieces of it back. This is the moment where a drowned homeland stops being an idea and becomes a physical fact. A bone in the hand, a harpoon on a museum shelf, a pollen grain under a microscope. Doggerland makes the whole question of lost lands tangible. If the ocean could erase an entire inhabited plain between two modern nations, and if we only found it because a fishing net happened to snag a mammoth tusk, then the sea has already proven its power to hide a human world in plain sight. The slow drowning was not a single event but a long retreat. As the ice melted and the sea rose, the coastline moved inland metre by metre year by year. Marshes became lagoons, lagoons became open water, and the high ground shrank into islands until those two disappeared. Families had to move again and again, carrying what they could, leaving behind the bones of their hunted animals, the tools they could not replace, and the memory of a landscape that was slowly turning into sea. Doggerland is not a theory. It is an accepted, documented, mapped, drowned homeland. And it sets a powerful precedent. If one drowned homeland is accepted, why should the same logic stop at Europe? Doggerland did not simply fade under a slow, patient sea. At some point the water came back fast. Around 8,000 years ago, a massive shelf of sediment off the coast of Norway broke loose. The slide was enormous. It displaced enough material to reshape a large piece of the seabed. And when that much earth moves underwater, the water does not stay still. The event is known today as the Storegga Slide. The name comes from Norwegian, the Great Edge. What it sent across the North Sea was a wall of water, a tsunami that hit the remaining lowlands of Doggerland with almost no warning. Imagine the world those waves struck. By that time, the ancient plain had already lost most of its territory to the slowly rising ocean. What remained were low islands, marshlands, narrow ridges, and shallow lagoons. People still lived there. They fished, they hunted, they moved between the shrinking patches of dry ground. They knew the sea was winning. What they did not know was that one day it would arrive not as a tide, but as a roar. When the Storegga wave crossed the shallow basin, it would have moved fast and high. The land had no cliffs to break it, no deep forest to slow it down. Everything close to sea level was exposed. Fishing camps, reed shelters, the trails that connected one hunting ground to another, all of it lay in the path of water that had nowhere else to go. A single event like that does not leave many human witnesses. But it does leave a mark. Tsunami deposits have been found in the sediments around the North Sea basin. Thin layers of sand and broken shells pushed far inland, sitting where no ordinary storm could have placed them. The geology recorded the violence, and if the geology recorded it, the survivors almost certainly carried it forward in a different medium, in story. A landscape can die slowly for centuries, then disappear in one remembered wave. That is the bridge between Doggerland and the oldest flood memories. A slow drowning can be explained as bad luck, as the way of the world. But a sudden catastrophe leaves a wound in memory. It becomes the story that grandparents tell, the wave that swallowed the hunting grounds, the year the sea rose without warning and never fully went back. No written record survives from the people of Doggerland. They left bones, tools, and silence. But if the pattern holds, the shape of that wave didn't vanish completely. It may have travelled forward in time, not as water, but as voice, as a fear passed from one generation to the next, wearing different names but carrying the same core. The sea is not always gentle, and land is not always safe. This is not to say that every flood myth is a memory of Strega. The world is large, and water has taken land in many places and at many speeds. What Doggerland offers is a clear, close example of how real trauma can harden into a story that outlasts the landscape itself. If it happened here, in the cold waters of northern Europe, why would it not happen elsewhere, in warmer seas, on wider shelves, among people who also lived at the edge of a rising ocean? If Europe carried this wound, what happened on the tropical shelves of Southeast Asia? If Europe carried the wound of a drowned homeland, the memory of that loss was preserved in nets and bones. But the same rising water that swallowed Doggerland was also reshaping the other side of the planet. The next drowned world is not cold, it is tropical, and its scale is so large that it turns the map inside out. Look at a modern map of Southeast Asia. You see a scattered chain of islands, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and thousands of smaller pieces of land. What you're really seeing are the highest peaks and ridges of a much larger continent that no longer exists. During the last ice age, when the ocean was lower by roughly 120 metres, those islands were connected. They formed a single landmass called Sundaland, a subcontinent nearly twice the size of India. The sea withdrew, and a warm, wet world emerged. Rivers wound through dense forests and mangrove swamps. The climate was stable, the land fertile, and the shallow coast teemed with fish and shellfish. This was not an empty wilderness. It was one of the richest human habitats on the planet. And for tens of thousands of years, people lived there, moved there, and left their traces across an expanse that now lies under the South China Sea, the Java Sea, and the Gulf of Thailand. Then the ice began to melt. Slowly, century by century, the water returned. The rivers widened. The mangrove forests drowned. The low plains where families had camped and hunted became lagoons, then open sea. Over thousands of years, the rising water ate away the land, separating the high ground into the islands we recognize today. Java, Sumatra, and Borneo were not always islands. They are the survivors of a drowned world. Indonesia was not always a chain of islands. It was once the broken roof of a larger world. The scale of this loss is almost impossible to picture. Imagine a landmass capable of supporting millions of people, a network of routes and settlements and gathering places, now reduced to scattered peaks above water. The people who lived there did not simply vanish. They moved, adapted, and carried their world with them in boats, in language, and in memory. The drowning of Sundaland reshaped the human story of half the globe. This is no longer just a European story. Doggerland showed us a cold, northern plain swallowed by the sea. Sundaland shows us that the same pattern played out on a tropical scale, erasing a living geography that may have been one of the great early stages of human culture. The pattern is global. The sea did not only take land from Europe, it took land from everywhere. So if the land broke apart and the people had to move, what did they carry with them? Did they only migrate, or did they carry older stories, older names, and older memories of the world before the water rose? The people did migrate, and modern genetics can now trace those old roots with surprising clarity. In recent research, a team led by Hee-Lim Kim and Tang-Hua Lee examined the genetic history of populations across Southeast Asia and South Asia. They found a clear signal. As sea levels rose after the last ice age, people moved. Their genes moved with them. Sundaland was not a barrier. It was a vast crossroads of forests, rivers, and coastal plains. When the water returned, the low-lying land broke apart. Groups that had once shared the same hunting grounds found themselves on separate islands. But the separation was not total. The genetic data show multiple waves of movement, each one matching a known period of rapid sea level rise. The map changed first, then people changed where they could live. Each time the sea rose, it created new islands and new coastlines. People who had lived in the lowlands moved inland or followed the retreating shore. Some crossed the new water gaps in simple boats. Others became isolated on mountains that turned into islands. Their genes record these separations. Scientists can see, in the DNA of people living on Java and Borneo today, traces of a common ancestor who walked the old Sunda plain. The same genetic threads appear in populations now separated by hundreds of kilometres of open water. The study combined ancient sea level maps with genetic models. It showed that the flooding of the continental shelf was not just a background event, it was the engine of movement. The rising seas did not simply drown a landscape, they scattered a human world. This genetic evidence is independent of archaeology. It does not require stone tools or buried foundations. It lives in the bodies of millions of people. And it tells the same story that the drowned map tells. A large human population lived on the exposed shelf. When the water came, they did not all vanish. They moved, they adapted, and they carried the memory of their former home in their very cells. The drowning of Sundaland was not just a geological event. It became a human story, written in the genes of descendants who never saw the lost plain. The land under the Java Sea and the South China Sea left a ghost in our biology. So even where no carved pillars or stone walls survive, the drowned world left a record. It is a record written in genes, and it confirms that the rising seas were not an abstract process. They were a force that scattered families and reshaped entire human populations. But if the coasts were so attractive that people lived there for tens of thousands of years, why would the old myths keep returning to flood and lost land? What made those shores so central to the human story? Why would early people choose the exact land that later disappeared? The answer is not hidden in complex theory. It sits in the simplest human needs: food, movement, and fresh water. Coasts gave all three in abundance. Fish and shellfish offered a reliable harvest that did not require planting or herding. Rivers meeting the sea brought fresh water to drink and fertile soil to grow food. The water itself was a road. A boat could cover more distance with less energy than a person walking. And where water routes crossed, people met, traded, and shared memory. These were not just places to survive. They were the richest environments available. The shore offered a daily richness that inland landscapes could not match without heavy work. So people gathered there. They built shelters, campfires, gathering places, and routes. Generations lived and died along the moving edge between land and water. But that edge had a hidden weakness. The same low, flat land that made life easy also made it vulnerable. When the Ice Age ended and the great melt poured into the oceans, the sea began to rise. The best human landscapes were the first to go under. The ocean did not erase random territory. It swallowed the prime real estate of the ancient world. We have walked through Doggerland and Sundaland, two lost worlds now underwater. Before the sea claimed them, they were vast, generous regions. The nets and dredges that pull up antler and bone from the North Sea are pulling up pieces of what was once some of the best land to live on. The genetic trails we trace through Southeast Asia map the movement of families leaving exactly those drowned coasts. The best land for survival was also the easiest land for the ocean to erase. That is not a small detail. It means the missing archive is not a random scatter of forgotten camps. It sat where people naturally gathered in the largest numbers and for the longest time. The ocean may have removed not just settlements, but the main stages of human life before writing. The places where languages formed, where stories first travelled, where the knowledge of the sea and stars grew dense with use. Preservation bias becomes a human cost. The survivors who moved inland carried fragments, but the centre of their world was gone. The shore that fed them, the roots that connected them, the gathering places that held their memory, all reshaped into seabed. So the question shifts again. If the ocean erased settlements and the lives built around them, what would survive on land as a memory of that loss? What kind of monument could hold the weight of a drowned homeland? From the drowned shores and the vanished camps of Doggerland, we turn now to a hill in southeastern Turkey. It does not look like a city. There are no streets, no granaries, no royal tombs. But carved into its summit are stones that should not be there. Not at this age, not in this form, not built by the hands that the standard story allows. The familiar picture of history runs like a ladder. First, humans hunt and gather. Then they settle, plant crops, keep animals, build villages. Villages grow into towns. Towns become cities. And only after cities, with their surplus food and organised labour, do monuments appear. That ladder feels logical. It is what the textbooks show, but this hill in Turkey breaks the rungs. In the middle of the last century, archaeologists looked at the top of a ridge and saw a mound that local farmers had long known. It did not seem especially old. Then, in the 1990s, the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began to dig. What emerged was not a village. It was a sanctuary of carved stone, placed here around the 10th millennium before Christ, more than 11,000 years ago, before pottery, before metal, before any known city. The pillars are T-shaped, some of them reaching 5 meters in height and weighing many tons. They were cut from the local limestone with flint tools, dragged up the slope and set into circular enclosures. And they are not smooth blank stones. Their surfaces carry reliefs, foxes, birds, serpents, scorpions, animals carved with a precision that makes the stone feel alive. These are not crude scratches, they are careful, deliberate statements in stone. Nothing like this was supposed to exist in a world without settled agriculture. A monument requires people who can be spared from survival. It requires shared belief strong enough to organize work that does not directly feed anyone. Every day spent cutting a pillar was a day not spent hunting, not spent gathering, not spent repairing a shelter. The cost was enormous. Yet people came here, again and again, to raise rings of stone on a hilltop under the open sky. And here is where the hill begins to feel like something more than an archaeological puzzle. After walking through the drowned landscapes of Doggerland and Sundaland, after tracing the moving shorelines that erase the most habitable land on the planet, a hill like this starts to look different. It rises like a memory made heavy, as if the people who built it carried an older loss and set it into stone where the water could not reach. A lost coastline cannot be rebuilt. A drowned plain cannot be reclaimed. But a monument can be raised on high ground, fixed against the horizon, visible for generations. If the first builders of Göbekli Tepe were survivors of a world that the sea had taken, they built something that would not float away. The standard story says monuments follow cities, but here the monument is older than any known city. It stands before the plough, before the kiln, before the first written word. That does not prove a lost civilization. One site cannot carry a claim that large. But it makes the simple version of history harder to keep. The question shifts from how did they move the stones to what was powerful enough to gather them. If a city did not call these people together, what did? And that question leads to another stranger detail. Göbekli Tepe was not simply abandoned. At some point, after centuries of use, the people who came here began to bury it. They filled the enclosures with rubble, carefully, deliberately, sealing the carved pillars under earth. They did not destroy the place, they covered it, as if putting it to rest. Why would anyone bury a monument that had cost so much to build? That is where the next trace begins. The hill of Göbekli Tepe is not only ancient, it is also sealed. The people who carved its pillars, who raised its enclosures, and who worked its stone for generations did something stranger than building. At some point, they stopped using the site, and then, deliberately, they buried it. Every day spent cutting limestone was a day not spent hunting, not spent gathering, not spent repairing a shelter or moving to a richer valley. The labour was immense, the pillars weighed tons, the animal reliefs were carved with care that took time, and after all that, after the feasts and gatherings and whatever drew people to this hill, later hands carried earth, debris and rubble into the enclosures. They filled the spaces between the T-shaped stones, they covered the carvings, they closed the circles. This was not neglect. This was not the slow collapse of an abandoned place. The burial was careful, almost methodical. It was as if someone decided that this monument should not remain standing in the open air. It should rest under the ground. What makes people build a place and then seal it away from the light? A temple that is no longer used can be left to crumble. A memory that is no longer safe can be hidden. The burial of Göbekli Tepe feels like an act of preservation. It is as if the builders and their descendants understood that something important was stored here, something that needed to be kept, not displayed. They did not destroy the site. They did not topple the stones. They covered them, gently, with the same earth that would later hide them for millennia. The act turns the hill from a monument of gathering into a monument of memory. The pillars become not only markers of a community, but time capsules sealed against a changing world. What were they protecting? Were they preserving the memory of a lost origin, a way of life that the rising seas had already begun to swallow? We cannot know, but the burial itself suggests that the people who closed Göbekli Tepe recognized its value. They may have been the last to understand its full meaning, and they chose to put it away rather than let it be forgotten or defaced. Perhaps they were survivors of a larger collapse, carrying fragments of a drowned coastal tradition inland. Perhaps the hill was their ark of stone. They did not only build the stone, they sealed it away from the future. That single act changes the question. It is no longer only about how hunter-gatherers organized to build something so early. It is about what they were trying to save and what loss they had already felt. The site becomes a land echo of a drowned world, a memorial raised at the edge of a changed geography. If land monuments could be sealed as memory, what might drowned monuments preserve underwater? The next trace takes us to a muddy bay in India, where sonar lines hint at something buried beneath the silt, a place where the sea may hold its own sealed chambers, waiting for someone to read them. From the sealed hill in Turkey, we move to a muddy bay in India where sonar lines trace something that should not be there. The Gulf of Khambhat, also called the Gulf of Cambay, lies off the western coast of Gujarat. For centuries it was just a busy arm of the Arabian Sea, a place of tides, fishing boats, and heavy silt. Then, in the early 2000s, marine scientists from India's National Institute of Ocean Technology began a routine survey. The sonar painted shapes on the seabed that looked less like random geology and more like a settlement waiting to be read. The images showed long, straight lines, right-angled features, and what appeared to be a regular grid spread across several square kilometres. At that depth, more than 30 metres down, the water is thick with sediment. The bottom is a soft, hungry mud that swallows light and hides detail, but the sonar kept returning the same impression: order, not accident. Underwater archaeology does not usually hand back a clean city wall. It gives fragments, a piece of pottery, a lump of wood, a worn stone that may have been shaped by a hand. The ocean works on everything: currents scrub, salt corrodes, marine life burrows, and silt buries. What survives is a broken archive. So when the team at Khambhat began to bring up material from the site, the finds were exactly the kind of splinters you would expect after thousands of years underwater. Chunks of pottery, a wooden log, a piece of what looked like a carved stone. Alone, any single item could be dismissed. Together, they made the sonar shapes harder to ignore. The real shock came from the dating. Wood samples recovered from the site were analysed in laboratories, and the results pointed to an age far older than the accepted timeline for this region. Some carbon dates suggested the material could be around 9,500 years old. That number does not fit the standard story. It places something organised in the Gulf of Khambhat long before the first cities of the Indus Valley, before the pyramids, before most of the markers we use to define civilization. The dates were immediately controversial. Some scientists argued the wood could have drifted from elsewhere, or that the sediment had mixed layers, or that the carbon results were unreliable in a marine environment. The debate grew loud, and then, as often happens with underwater sites, it quieted without a final answer. The argument itself is not the story. The story is that the Gulf of Khambhat feels like a page pulled from the mud before anyone knew how to read it. The sonar lines are there, the recovered material is real. The dates, whether fully accepted or still contested, pull the imagination toward a larger possibility. That the seabed off India may hold traces of a drowned coastal world that existed when the shoreline was much farther out, when the Gulf was not a bay but a low plain crossed by rivers and dotted with camps. One site is not enough to redraw the map. The fragments from Khambhat do not prove a lost city, but they are a signal that the ocean archive is not empty, that the mud is not mute, and that every time a net or a sonar beam touches the bottom, it may brush against a story we have never properly heard. And that raises a question that keeps the Gulf of Khambhat alive as a mystery. If a single dredge sample can suggest a timeline that old, what would a full excavation change? The bay remains mostly unexplored by modern methods. The currents are fierce, the visibility is near zero, and the cost is enormous. The site waits, half seen, half understood, a muddy question mark on the continental shelf. So the sea does not return history as a clean wall, it returns splinters. The next splinter takes us to a place where stone seems to remember a staircase, a formation that divers have argued about for decades, off a small island at the far edge of the Pacific. The Gulf of Khambhat leaves us with fragments and questions, but the difficulty of reading those fragments is not a weakness of the story, it is the nature of the archive. Most of human history is not written, it is not carved into stone tablets waiting on a dry floor, it lies under moving water, buried in silt that shifts with every tide. The sea does not preserve things the way a desert tomb preserves them. It breaks them, scatters them, and covers them again. Reading history underwater is not like opening a book. It is like trying to read a book while it's still buried in mud, with only a few words visible and the pages dissolving as you turn them. Currents move through these sites like weather. Sediment clouds the water until a diver can barely see a hand in front of the mask. Pressure increases with every metre of depth, squeezing equipment and shortening the time a human being can stay down. And then there is the cost. A single season of underwater excavation can require ships, sonar arrays, remotely operated vehicles, teams of divers, and years of preparation. Every fragment that reaches the surface carries an enormous price tag. Most of the seabed has never been seen by human eyes, not because it is empty, but because looking is so difficult. The archive is broken in ways that land archaeology rarely faces. Wood disappears. Organic material rots away unless it is sealed in an oxygen-free layer of mud. Stone survives longer, but even stone shifts. Earthquakes, currents, and the weight of water can move blocks far from their original positions. A wall that once stood straight can become a scattered pile. A terrace that once marked a shoreline can end up tilted on a slope. The sea does not return history as a clean wall. It returns splinters. Only the most durable materials survive for thousands of years underwater. Stone tools, bone fragments, shells, pollen grains, and sometimes the ghostly outlines of structures that once stood on dry land. Everything softer is gone. Wooden boats, woven baskets, textiles, food remains, the bodies of the people themselves. In many cases, all that remains is a pattern on a sonar screen, a shape that looks too regular, an arrangement of stones that does not match the surrounding geology, a hint of geometry in the darkness. This difficulty makes every fragment precious. A single piece of worked stone pulled from the mud off the coast of India is not just an artifact, it is a survivor. It has passed through thousands of years of currents, chemical changes, and the slow grinding of sediment. The fact that it exists at all is remarkable. But a fragment cannot tell the whole story. It can only suggest. It can only raise questions. And that is where the disputed sites become important. Sites like the Gulf of Khambhat or Yonaguni do not matter because they prove a case. They matter because they show how much we cannot yet read. They are not clean museums with labels and dates. They are problems. They are sonar lines that look like walls. They are stone terraces that look like stairs. They are fragments that arrived with an age that seems too old for the familiar timeline. None of these sites, on their own, can carry the weight of a lost civilization. But together, they do something else. They make the simple version of history harder to keep. If the seabed were easy to read, we would have read it by now. The difficulty is not a sign that nothing is there. It is a sign that the archive is locked, and we are only beginning to learn how to open it. Every dredged piece of old wood, every sonar image that refuses to look natural, every stone terrace that catches the light in an unexpected way, is a reason to keep looking. Not because the answers are certain, but because the questions are too large to ignore. The ocean archive is real. It is damaged, fragmented, and buried. But that damage is not a reason to dismiss it. It is a reason to look more carefully, to learn new ways of reading, to accept that the first chapter of human civilization may not come to us as a complete text. It may come as a handful of broken pages, recovered one at a time from the dark water. Nowhere is this more visually striking than at Yonaguni, where stone terraces rise like a staircase into the unknown. The water off a Japanese island is clearer than the mud of Khambhat, but the stone below it is just as hard to read. Off the southern coast of Yonaguni, divers descend toward a formation that rises from the seabed like a broken monument. The rock is massive, its surfaces are flat, its edges are sharp in ways that make the brain search for a builder. The main face slopes in broad terraces, one level stepping down to the next, as if the stone remembered a staircase that someone once shaped. The formation sits in water that is not impossibly deep. Divers can reach it without the heavy machines that would be needed for the Cuban anomaly, and when they swim along its walls they pass channels that cut straight through the rock, vertical drops that feel too deliberate to be accidents of fracture, and a long horizontal platform that looks almost like a roadbed pressed into the sea floor. The scale shrinks a human figure. One diver beside the main terrace becomes a small silhouette against a geometry that does not belong in the ordinary language of coral and current. Nature can make straight lines. Water, pressure, and time can split stone into blocks that look quarried. Sandstone and mudstone, the materials that form much of the Yonaguni structure, are known to crack along flat planes and right angles in other parts of the world. No one who studies the site seriously denies that natural forces could have carved many of its features. The argument is not that geology is helpless here, but the scale and the arrangement make the eye hesitate. It is not one straight edge. It is a series of them. It is not one terrace. It is a stack of levels that descend like a giant step pyramid turned on its side. It is not one channel cutting through the rock, but multiple parallel cuts that seem to organize the space. The formation does not give easy answers. It gives a question that the water will not let go. One terrace can be nature. A whole underwater staircase, with flat treads and vertical rises repeated across the site, makes the simpler explanation feel less comfortable. A single right angle is unremarkable, but when the angles repeat, when the flat surfaces align across different levels, when the channels run in the same direction as if they were part of a single plan, the eye begins to doubt the ordinary story. The stone starts to look less like a random fracture, and more like something that was worked, modified, or at least selected and emphasized by hands that are no longer present. This is not a place that proves a lost civilization. It does not carry inscriptions. It does not hold tools. No carved figures have been pulled from its crevices. No datable organic material has been sealed inside its walls. The site remains exactly what it has been for decades. A visual puzzle that refuses to resolve into a final answer. But that is also why it matters. The ocean rarely hands up clean proof. It returns splinters, fragments, and geometry that will not let the question close. Yonaguni is one of those splinters. It keeps the visual pressure on the timeline without offering a verdict. And so the question shifts. It becomes not is this natural or artificial, but why does it still feel like a ruin? Why does the human eye keep returning to this particular rock, in this particular arrangement, and refuse to walk away satisfied with the geological explanation? The answer may say as much about the viewer as it says about the stone, but the fact that the question persists, decade after decade, is itself a kind of evidence. The past has shapes that are not yet fully read. If nature alone could produce such a convincing imitation of architecture, then the boundary between design and accident is thinner than the textbooks pretend. And if human hands once touched this stone, if the terraces and channels were cut, widened, or aligned by people who lived before the sea rose to cover their work, then Yonaguni is not an isolated curiosity. It is another page in the drowned archive waiting for someone to learn the language of its geometry. We left Yonaguni with the question, why does it still feel like a ruin? Now we return to that feeling because the eye test matters. The Yonaguni monument does not give easy answers. It sits off the coast of Yonaguni Island in the Ryukyu chain, a structure of stepped terraces, flat platforms, and right-angled channels cut into the sandstone bedrock. From the surface, you see only blue water. Dive down about 25 meters, and the shape begins to emerge. A main terrace stretching over 50 meters, a sharp drop, then another level below, with block-like corners and what looks like a triangular pool surrounded by stone walls. The scale is not subtle, the geometry does not hide. To a geologist, the most familiar explanation is natural jointing and erosion. The sandstone of this region fractures cleanly along vertical and horizontal planes, creating block-like forms that can look like cut stone. Wave action and currents can widen those fractures into channels and straight edges. On land, similar formations exist, and they are rightly understood as the work of water and time. That is the sober, careful reading. And it is not wrong. But to a diver floating above the monument, the scale and the repetition feel different. The terraces rise like an underwater staircase, each step a flat shelf. The edges are sharp. The triangular pool is surrounded by what look like retaining walls, and a broad, level platform faces the open ocean like a stage. The eye cannot easily dismiss it. Even knowing the geological explanation, the mind keeps searching for a human reason. That struggle between two ways of seeing is exactly what makes Yonaguni powerful. What if both views are partly right? What if a natural shore platform formed by wave action when sea levels were lower was later modified by human hands? Perhaps ancient people carved steps, widened channels, or smoothed surfaces for a purpose we can no longer read. That would explain the mix of natural and artificial features, a site that began geologically but was shaped culturally. This is not a compromise, it is a pattern we see on land. Many ancient sites use natural caves or rock outcrops as foundations for temples and tombs. Underwater, the evidence is harder to secure, but the idea is not unreasonable. The value of Yonaguni, then, is not in winning the argument one way or the other, it is in keeping the question visible. It forces us to admit that the ocean can hold forms that resist a simple label, and that resistance matters, because it reminds us how little we know about the submerged past. The stone may not speak clearly, but it refuses to look ordinary. That refusal is enough to keep it in the story. Yonaguni reminds us that the ocean archive is not a library of clean answers, it is a gallery of visual puzzles. Each puzzle asks us to look harder, to test our assumptions about what nature alone can produce and what human labour might add. To see what a confirmed drowned city looks like, we now move to a place where the sea gave back not just stone, but statues and inscriptions. That is the story of Thonis-Heracleion, a city that vanished from the map and then returned. From the ambiguous stone of Yonaguni, we move to a place where the sea gave back not just stone, but statues and inscriptions, a city whose name was almost lost. It was called Thonis by the Egyptians, Heracleion by the Greeks, and for more than 1,000 years it existed only in a handful of old texts, a trading port at the mouth of the Nile that had simply vanished from the map. For centuries, scholars could only guess at its location. The written records described a grand harbour, a temple to Amun-Gereb, a place where Greek merchants and Egyptian priests mixed before the Mediterranean swallowed it. But no ruins on land matched the description, and the memory of the city faded into legend. Then, at the turn of the millennium, a team led by the underwater archaeologist Frank Goddio began to search the seabed of Abukir Bay, about 6.5 kilometres from the modern shore. What they found beneath the silt and dark water was not a myth. It was a city sitting upright on the seafloor, preserved in astonishing detail. The first thing to understand is how a city can disappear like this. The ground beneath Heracleion was never solid rock. It was a mixture of clay and silt deposited by the Nile, soft and waterlogged. Over time, the weight of the temples and palaces pressed down on that unstable foundation, squeezing the water out and causing the soil to compact. Meanwhile, the sea level was slowly rising and the land was sinking. The combined effect was a slow, relentless subsidence. The city did not fall off a cliff. It settled into the water gradually, building by building, until the streets became canals and the rooftops became seabed. When Goddio's team began to excavate, they uncovered a world frozen in time. Colossal statues of pharaohs and gods lay where they had toppled, their faces still painted with traces of red and gold. A huge granite statue of Hapi, the god of the Nile flood, stood over 5 meters tall, its surface worn smooth by centuries of currents. Nearby, a statue of a Ptolemaic queen, her features still sharp, gazed upward into the darkness. Gold coins, bronze vessels, and delicate jewellery emerged from the silt. The divers found inscribed stone slabs, stelae, with royal decrees that confirmed the city's identity beyond any doubt. One stele, over 2 meters high, spelled out the name Heracleion Thonis, and the taxes levied on Greek ships. They found the remains of more than 60 ancient ships, some still loaded with amphorae, the ceramic containers that once carried wine, olive oil, and grain across the Mediterranean. An entire harbour district stretched across the seafloor, with quays, breakwaters, and mooring posts still in position. A temple complex dedicated to Amun-Gereb, the very temple mentioned in the old texts, emerged from the sediment. Its walls still held the grooves where priests had poured libations, and its sanctuary still contained the base of a massive stone altar. This is not a myth. It is a documented loss and a documented rediscovery. The sea took a thriving city, one that was well known, well recorded, and central to the economy of the ancient world, and it erased it so completely that even its name became uncertain. And then, after more than a millennium, the sea gave it back. If a city this large and well recorded could disappear from human memory for over 1,000 years, what about older, smaller, unnamed settlements? What about the coastal camps and villages that dotted the Ice Age shelves, places that had no scribes to write their names and no stone temples to mark their existence? Heracleion proves that the sea can erase a functioning urban world and preserve its remains in darkness. The mechanism is real. The ground can fail, the water can rise, and an entire community can sink below the surface without a single visible trace on land. How does a city's disappearance become a story? The answer lies not only in the objects recovered, but in the memory that survives in texts and traditions, the faint echo that kept the name Heracleion alive long enough for divers to find it. The next question is what happens when the echo is older and the name is lost. Heracleion gave back its name and its gods. But the deeper lesson is about memory itself, how a place can be remembered, then forgotten, then found again. Think of a name you once knew well, a person, a street, a village. One day you realize you cannot recall it. The shape is there, the feeling is there, but the word has slipped away. Years pass. Then a photograph, a smell, a fragment of an old song brings it back, whole and sharp. Heracleion was like that, but stretched across centuries. Ancient writers knew the city. Herodotus wrote of its temple. Later the name faded, maps forgot it. For more than 1,000 years, Heracleion existed only as a faint textual memory, a place some scholars even doubted was real. Then, in the early 2000s, divers touched stone in Abu Qir Bay. The sea gave back what the land had lost. When Frank Godio's team found those colossal granite statues of a pharaoh, a queen, and the god Hapi, they were not just pulling art from the sea, they were reattaching a broken thread of memory. The inscriptions named the city, its rituals, its role in trade and religion. A place that had faded into myth became geography again. The statues were not silent objects, they were memory anchors. Each carved face, each hieroglyphic line, reconnected the present to a world that had seemed unreachable. This process, loss, forgetting, rediscovery, may repeat across many drowned places. The ocean does not erase memory entirely. It stores it, patiently, waiting for a moment of recovery. A wooden hull, a bronze coin, a stone inscription can survive for millennia in dark, still water. They do not speak, but they wait. And when someone finally reaches them, they can restart a story that had seemed finished. But Heracleion had a name. It had stone, it had written records. What about coasts that drowned before writing existed? What about settlements where the only memory was carried in song, in a story told around a fire, in a path marked by a shell mound? When those places sank, the names sank with them. No text survived to call them back. The sea did not just take the land, it took the memory of the land. That is a different order of loss. It is the difference between a book that falls into water and a book that was never written down, and yet something may still remain. Not a statue with an inscription, but a fragment of worked stone. A midden, a tool, a genetic trace, a story that slowly turned into a flood myth. The pattern Heracleion reveals is not just about one city, it is about the fragility of human memory when the ground itself disappears. For every Thonis-Heracleion we recover, there may be 100 older shores that left no name, no carved face, no temple wall, only a shoreline that kept retreating, and families who carried what they could and never returned. Heracleion shows that the ocean can keep a secret for millennia, and then give it back, piece by piece. It is a promise and a warning. The promise is that the sea holds more than we know. The warning is that most of what it holds may be anonymous, places without names, people without records, worlds that vanish so completely that even their echo is faint. This pattern of loss and memory leads us to a time of widespread collapse, when ships moved not for trade but for survival. The sea peoples emerged from the chaos. In the 12th century before Christ, something broke across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities that had stood for centuries began to burn. Trade routes that carried copper, tin, grain and olive oil fell silent. Palaces in Mycenaean Greece were abandoned so quickly that storerooms were left full of jars. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was emptied, and along the coasts of the Levant and Egypt ships appeared on the horizon, carrying people who seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. Their inscriptions at Medinet Habu show chaotic naval battles, families in ox-drawn carts following the warships, and a sense that the whole world was on the move. For a long time, the standard picture was simple: a mysterious confederation of invaders swept down from the north, burning and looting until the great powers collapsed. But the more archaeologists and historians look at that period, the less simple it becomes. Some of the names in the Egyptian records echo places that were themselves falling apart. The Peliset may be linked to the Philistines, who settled on the coast of Canaan after the upheaval. The Denian might be connected to the Danaui of Homeric memory. The Lucca came from the southwest coast of Anatolia, a region that would later be known as Lycia. These were not necessarily a single army marching under one banner. They may have been a wave of displaced people, survivors of collapsing kingdoms, moving by ship because the land routes were gone. Picture a family on a boat. Not a warship, but a crowded vessel carrying children, grain, a few tools, and whatever could be salvaged from a home that no longer existed. They were not sailing to conquer. They were sailing because the fields had failed, because the palace that once organized trade could no longer feed them, because the sea offered the only road left. The causes of the Bronze Age collapse are still debated. Scholars point to a combination of pressures: earthquakes, drought, famine, the breakdown of long-distance trade networks, and possibly the arrival of new military technology. But there is another possibility that sits quietly in the background. The same period saw changes in sea level and coastal environments. Not a single catastrophic flood, but a slow, grinding pressure on the low-lying ports and farmlands that supported the great kingdoms. If your coastal fields turned to salt marsh, if your harbour silted up, if the fish moved away, the entire foundation of a city could erode before anyone wrote down the reason. The Sea Peoples remind us that catastrophe does not only destroy, it also moves people. And those movements become stories that later generations may not fully understand. The Egyptians recorded them as enemies, as a threat to be repelled. But from the decks of those crowded ships, the story might have felt very different. It might have felt like survival. Sometimes the people history calls invaders may be survivors with nowhere left to land. They carried their world with them in fragments, names, skills, memories of places that were already underwater or in ruins, and when they finally reached a shore that would take them, they built again. This is not just military history. It is a story of environmental and social pressure folding into human movement, and it raises a larger question. If a period of collapse that we can read about in Egyptian inscriptions and Greek ruins could generate such powerful myths of wandering and displacement, what older collapse might have generated the greatest myth of all? Plato wrote of an island power that sank beneath the waves. His date, 9,000 years before his own time, still echoes beside the drowned world we have been tracing. The Sea Peoples were a memory that survived in texts and names. What if Atlantis is the same kind of memory, but older, larger, and pushed further into the realm of story because the water took everything else? The story that has echoed for millennia does not begin with a diver or a sonar scan. It begins with a man sitting in Athens, writing about an island that no longer existed. Plato wrote two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, more than 23 centuries ago. In them, an old Egyptian priest tells the Greek statesman Solon about a powerful island kingdom. It lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar. It was larger than Libya and Asia combined, a naval power that dominated the known world. And then, Plato wrote, in a single day and night of misfortune, it sank beneath the sea. The date the priest gave was 9,000 years before Solon's time. For Plato, that placed the destruction around 9,600 years before Christ. Plato was a philosopher, not a historian of lost islands. Most scholars read the Atlantis story as an allegory about the dangers of imperial ambition, a moral tale where the ideal state, Athens, defeats a corrupt sea empire. The island was a teaching tool, not a map coordinate, but the number remains. 9,000 years. It is a number that sits in an uncomfortable place. The end of the last ice age, the great melt, the rise of the sea by more than 100 meters, the drowning of continental shelves and coastal plains, all of it falls around that same window. The world that was disappearing, the world of Doggerland and Sundaland, of exposed shorelines and drowned valleys, was still being erased around 9,600 years before the Common Era. The memory of that erasure would still have been young, carried by the descendants of people who watched the water swallow their land. Plato could not have known about glacial cycles or sea level curves. He had no access to the maps we now draw of the pre-flood world. And yet his story places a catastrophic drowning exactly when the real ocean was finishing its long rise. The island, the great power, vanishes in a single day and night, just as a tsunami could have finished the last stretch of Doggerland, or a sudden shelf collapse could have sent a wave over a low coastal settlement. The location, too, is suggestive. Beyond the Pillars of Heracles out in the Atlantic is exactly where the sea hides nothing but deep ocean now. But it's also the direction a memory might travel if it came from a people who once lived on an Atlantic coast that no longer exists. A coast that was pushed back by rising water, its islands reduced to seamounts, its bays turned into abyssal plains. Atlantis is not a historical record. It is not a map we can use, but it may be a container for older memories of drowned lands, a story-shaped vessel that carried an ancient terror across millennia. The detail of the date, the detail of the location, the detail of the sudden sinking, all three line up with the kind of event that the Ocean Archive keeps suggesting. Plato's Atlantis is not just an island. It is an old date standing beside a drowned world. Whether a literal island kingdom matching Plato's description ever existed is a question that archaeology cannot yet answer. What the story does is preserve the idea of a lost civilization beneath the waves, the same idea that Doggerland's nets, Sundaland's broken roof, and the statues of Heracleion all keep returning to. The idea that the sea took something, and that something was remembered, however dimly in the oldest stories we have. If Plato's story is one echo of a larger memory, how many other cultures kept the same wound under different names? Plato's date was not the only echo of a world drowned. Long before him, in the land between the rivers, scribes pressed an older flood into clay. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written on tablets more than 3,000 years ago, tells of a king who travelled far to find a survivor of the Great Deluge. The survivor, Utnapishtim, described how the gods sent a flood to destroy humanity, how he built a boat, how he loaded his family and the seed of all living things, and how he released birds to search for dry land. The boat came to rest on a mountain peak and the world began again. Some scholars treat the story as pure literature, but when the Ice Age ended and seas rose by 120 metres, real shorelines vanished. Real people must have carried the memory of losing land to water. It is possible that the Mesopotamian flood tradition is not only a story, it is a distant echo of catastrophic flooding that reshaped the world their ancestors knew. In India, the Shatapatha Brahmana tells of Manu, warned by a fish to build a boat. The flood came, and Manu alone survived, later repopulating the earth. In Greece, Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha built a chest to ride out a flood sent by Zeus. After the waters receded, they threw stones that became a new humanity. These stories are not identical, they do not describe the same event. But the shared pattern, a boat, a survivor, a warning, a new beginning, appears in cultures separated by mountains and seas. It is likely that these myths carry the memory of real flooding, not one global flood, but many local and regional disasters that marked the end of the Ice Age and the drowning of low-lying coasts. Seen this way, a flood myth is not simply imagination. It is a verbal fossil. It preserves the shape of a drowned homeland, the terror of water arriving where life used to be, and the small hope of a survivor who floated above a lost world. In the absence of writing, the drowned world survived in story. The coastlines vanished, but the names and the terror and the boat remained, passed down until they reached clay and parchment. Myth became a vessel for memory, carrying the lost landscape across thousands of years. Now we have gathered physical traces from the ocean floor and mythic echoes from the human voice. The next step is to bring them together. What pattern forms when sonar lines, sunken coastlines, survivor monuments, drowned cities and flood stories are placed side by side? It began with a shape in the darkness. More than 600 meters below the sea near western Cuba, sonar picked up something that did not fit the random geology of the abyssal plain. Grid-like forms, blocky shapes, right angles where there should have been none. That single anomaly, suspended in the deep, felt like a door opening onto a question too large for one sight alone. The question was not only whether the Cuban shapes were human-made. The deeper problem was what their depth implied. If land that deep once held a structure, the familiar timeline of human civilization was pressed against a much older shoreline. The ocean was not a passive blue surface. It was an archive, and that first object was only the topmost clue. Now, after moving through drowned landscapes, survivor monuments, vanished cities and old memories, the pieces begin to connect. Each site, at first glance, seemed like an isolated curiosity. Doggerland was a lost plain between Britain and Europe, its bones and tools hauled up by fishing nets. Sundaland was a tropical continent broken into modern islands. Göbekli Tepe was a hill of carved stone built before cities existed. Heracleion was a port city that sank into the Mediterranean with its statue still standing. And Atlantis was a name in an old book, a date whispered by Plato that pointed to the end of the Ice Age. Taken one by one, they could be dismissed or debated. A natural formation, a local flood, a myth dressed up as history. But when you step back and look at the chain, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Each site represents a different expression of the same planetary process: sea level rise after the last glacial maximum. The water came back slowly, and then sometimes violently, and it swallowed the very land that humans had most reason to live on. Coasts, river mouths, shallow seas rich with food, these were not marginal spaces. They were the engines of early human life, and they are now under meters of water, sometimes hundreds of meters. The Cuban anomaly, Doggerland, Sundaland, Göbekli Tepe, Heracleion, Atlantis, they are not separate stories. They are fragments of one larger story that the ocean has been telling us in pieces. The North Sea plain shows us what a drowned homeland looks like when the sea rises slowly. Sundaland shows us the same process on a tropical scale, where entire migration routes were erased. Göbekli Tepe suggests what survivors might build on high ground when their old coasts were gone. Heracleion proves that a city can vanish so completely that only texts remember it, until divers touch the stone again. And Atlantis, whether literal or not, carries the memory of that loss in a form that has survived for millennia. One drowned place is a mystery. A chain of drowned places becomes a map of a missing chapter in human history. The ocean has not been a random destroyer. It has been a systematic eraser of the earliest coastal landscapes, the very places where people first gathered in larger numbers, where they traded, fished, built, and buried their dead. If those coasts were the cradles of something we might call civilization, then the evidence has been sitting underwater, scattered across the continental shelves of the world. What begins to emerge is not a single lost empire, not one Atlantis with marble columns and golden roofs. The picture is more subtle and more powerful. It is a network, a web of coastal settlements, routes, gathering places, and memory systems that stretched along the shorelines of the last ice age. When those shorelines moved, the network broke. Some pieces were lost completely. Others were carried inland, rebuilt on higher ground, remembered in stone and story. The first visible civilizations may not have been the first. They may have been the heirs of a drowned world that the sea has kept hidden until now. So the question is no longer whether there is something under the water. The question is what exactly was erased. What kind of civilization could disappear without leaving a pyramid on land? What shape did it take? And how much of it still waits in the dark? When we hear the words lost civilization, the mind usually paints a single picture: a capital city of stone, a pyramid or a palace rising above a desert, a king, a throne, an empire that rose and then collapsed into ruin. That image comes from the civilizations we can still see on land, where a central monument anchors the story. But if the best human land was coastal, the world that drowned may have looked nothing like that single capital. It may have been a web, not a hub, a living network stretched along shorelines rather than concentrated in one city. Think of what a coastal life requires. It is not about conquering territory on a map. It is about knowing the water, reading currents, stars, and the colour of the sky before a storm. It is about boats that can carry families, goods, and ideas between river mouths and sheltered bays. It is about shell mounds that grow for generations, marking a place where people returned again and again, not because a king ordered it, but because the fish were right, the fresh water was close, and the route was safe. These people left traces, but they are not the traces we are trained to see. A wooden boat decays, a fishing camp becomes sediment, a shell midden can be mistaken for a natural bank. The knowledge of tides and navigation does not fossilize. The rituals shared across islands and coasts may survive only in patterns of pottery or in the shape of a paddle, not in a carved inscription. That is why the familiar image of a lost empire with a central ruin misleads us. It trains us to look for a single broken city on dry land. But if the civilization we are chasing was maritime, its remains would be scattered, subtle, and largely underwater. The archive is not a desert, it is the seabed. A maritime network can be highly complex without ever building a pyramid. It can connect distant regions through trade, shared language, and common ritual practice. It can support large populations on a narrow strip of coast, feeding itself from the sea and the rivers, and it can vanish almost completely when the shoreline moves inland. The disappearance would not be a single cataclysm, like a volcano or a war. It would be slow. The water rises a little each lifetime. A village moves a few hundred meters back. A sacred site on a low island is abandoned. A route that once linked two bays becomes open ocean. Over thousands of years, the whole geography of the network dissolves, and its memory scatters into the stories of the people who moved to higher ground. This redefinition makes the thesis clearer and more believable. The lost civilization does not need one capital city. It does not need an emperor or a standing army. It can be a coastal network, a maritime culture that wove together the edges of continents before the ice melted. No single ruin will announce it. But the pattern of drowned shelves, the old myths of flood and lost land, the sudden appearance of monument building on high ground, all begin to make sense when we stop looking for a pyramid and start looking for a shoreline. If that network drowned, the question is not where its capital was. The question is what the survivors carried with them. What fragments of a maritime world would people cling to as they moved inland? What skills, what stories, what memories of the sea would shape the first monuments they built on dry land? Picture the last families leaving a coastal settlement as the water crept higher each season. There was no single day of catastrophe for everyone. For many, the loss was slow. A flooded garden, a submerged path, a shoreline that never returned. When they moved inland, they carried what they could. Boats that had once been tools for fishing became vehicles for escape. Knowledge of stars that had guided navigation at sea became a memory of an older way of reading the sky. Stories of the great water, of the places it covered, became something to tell children by the fire. These fragments were not lost. They travelled with the people, folded into the new lives they built on higher ground. Over generations, those fragments settled into new cultures. They did not simply disappear. They changed shape. A sacred hill was not only a high place. It was the memory of safety above the water, a piece of the drowned world turned into stone and ritual. Early boat symbolism in religion was not only poetry. It was the echo of a time when the boat was the difference between life and disappearance. And the flood myths that appear in so many traditions were not just stories. They were a way of saying, our people came from somewhere else, and that somewhere else is now under the sea. This is not to romanticize the survivors. They were not a single people, and they did not all tell the same story. But across different regions, in different languages, the same deep motifs appear. Water, loss, memory, and the high place where life began again. That pattern makes one question harder to ignore. Did the first civilizations that we can read about on land inherit something from a drowned maritime world? Did they carry forward skills, symbols, and stories that were born on coastlines that no longer exist? The monuments and myths we see are not the absolute beginning. They are the rebuild after a loss that most of the evidence cannot name. The carved pillars, the temple boats, the old flood names, these are not the first page. They are the first page that survived. So the next question is not whether Sumer and Egypt were the first civilizations. It is what came before them, beneath the water, in the chapter that had no writing. The standard picture of civilization begins in a handful of river valleys. Sumer appears with cities, writing, and temple records. Egypt rises beside the Nile with stone monuments and a carefully ordered state. The Indus and the Yellow River follow. The textbook sequence is clear. Farming, villages, surplus, writing, kings, and the first great works of stone. But if a coastal network existed before the ice sheets melted, then Sumer and Egypt may not be the pioneers, they may be the inheritors. Not as a diminished version of themselves, not as copyists, but as cultures that absorbed older fragments and rebuilt them in a new, drier world. The skills of boat building, navigation, and reading the stars did not appear from nowhere in the 4th millennium before Christ. They may have been carried inland by people who once lived at the edge of a different sea. The clues are scattered but suggestive. The Sumerians preserved a story of a great flood that swept over the world before kingship descended again from heaven. The hero builds a boat, saves life, and restarts civilization on a changed Earth. It is the oldest surviving written version of a catastrophe that sounds less like a local river flood and more like the memory of a drowning coast. In Egypt, boats were not only practical, they were central to the journey of the sun and the dead. The pharaoh was buried with ships, sometimes buried whole, sometimes disassembled beside pyramids, ready for a voyage through water. In a desert kingdom, the sea and the river held a sacred weight that feels older than the first dynasties. Across early civilizations, a few motifs repeat. The world emerges from a primeval ocean. A mound rises from the water. A boat carries the first beings. These images are not proof of a single lost source, but they are consistent enough to raise a question. Are these separate inventions, or are they echoes of a shared, older, watery world? This does not take anything away from the achievements of Sumer and Egypt. Their cities, their writing, their art, and their laws are real. They change the planet. But the story may not begin with them. It may only become visible with them. Maybe the first page we can read was not the first page ever written by human life. Maybe it was the first page that survived the flood. If that is even a possibility, then the familiar timeline is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. The beginning we see from the dry land may be a second beginning, rebuilt by people who remembered more than they could record, and who carried the ocean inside their myths, their boats, and their sacred hills. So if this prologue is real, why has history been so slow to look for it? What has kept the seabed so quiet? The deep ocean floor is not a silent museum waiting for a visitor to open the door. It is a realm of crushing weight, absolute darkness, and soft sediment that buries every surface like a slow, relentless snowfall. At 600 meters, the pressure is over 60 times what the human body feels at sea level. At 1,000 meters, the light has long since vanished. At several thousand meters, the water temperature hovers only a few degrees above freezing. This is the environment where any trace of an ancient coastal world would now lie, and it does not give up its secrets easily. To reach that environment, you cannot simply walk out with a trowel and a brush. Underwater archaeology on the open shelf requires specialized research vessels that can cost tens of thousands of dollars a day to operate. It requires remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, tethered by cables and controlled from a surface ship, their cameras peering through clouds of disturbed silt. It requires side-scan sonar that can map the seabed in strips, but can only hint at what might be buried under the mud. And if a target is found at a depth human divers can reach, their time on the bottom is brutally short. At 30 meters, a diver might have 20 minutes of working time before decompression limits force a slow, cautious return to the surface. At 50 meters, the margin shrinks to a handful of minutes. Every minute of work is bought with hours of preparation, heavy equipment, helium-rich breathing mixtures, and the constant risk of nitrogen narcosis or the bends. The ocean does not simply conceal the past, it actively resists any effort to touch it. The financial cost magnifies that resistance. A single season of deepwater survey can run into millions of dollars, and funding for prehistoric underwater research is scarce. Governments and institutions tend to favour shipwrecks and treasure, which have clear boundaries and a known historical value. A sunken galleon full of gold coins is easier to justify than a submerged landscape that might contain only fragments of stone tools, pollen grains, and old campfires. The continental shelves are vast, stretching for thousands of kilometres along every coast, and only a tiny fraction has been surveyed with enough resolution to spot a human-made structure. Political boundaries add another layer of difficulty. The seabed off one country might hold traces of a past that another country claims as its own heritage, and permits, treaties, and territorial disputes can stall a project for years. None of this means the archive is empty. It means the archive is locked behind a barrier of physics, money and time that we're only beginning to understand how to overcome. A growing network of researchers, including the European project known as Splash Costs, has been systematically mapping submerged prehistoric landscapes, combining bathymetry, sediment cores, and computer modelling to reconstruct the drowned worlds of the last ice age. Their work has already revealed river channels, ancient lagoons, and former coastlines far out on the continental shelf, but the sheer scale of the task is overwhelming. For every square kilometre that has been examined, 1,000 remain untouched. The ocean is not silent because it is empty, It is silent because it is hard to read, and we have not yet built the tools or gathered the will to read it at the speed the mystery demands. The archive is there, pressing into the mud under a weight of water that has not lifted for thousands of years. What waits inside it is not a single city or a single monument, but a scattered record of human life along coasts that no longer exist. Foundations of wooden structures, accumulations of shell and bone, the stone tools of people who watch the shoreline move season by season, and perhaps, in the deepest layers, the pollen of plants that grew in a world before the Great Melt. Unlocking that archive will take decades of patient survey, new technologies for imaging through sediment, and a shift in how we value the hidden past. The question is no longer whether the first chapter of human civilization lies underwater. The question is what exactly is waiting under the sediment, and when we will finally decide to look. Imagine the seabed not as a flat, empty plain, but as a drowned landscape. Under the silt and the cold, dark water lie ancient river valleys, former lagoons, forests that once rose under the sun. The shape of the land is still there, buried and waiting. The conditions down there are almost perfect for preservation. Cold temperatures, low oxygen, and deep darkness slow decay to a crawl. Wood, seeds, even animal tissue can survive for thousands of years in a state that dry land would never allow. The very forces that hide these places also protect what fell into them. So what might actually be down there? Stone tools, certainly. The remains of wooden boats or fishing weirs, the charcoal from old hearths. Pollen grains that tell a story of the vegetation that grew on vanished coastlines. And sometimes, in the right conditions, bones, human bones, still holding traces of DNA, still carrying the chemical signature of a diet tied to the sea. This is not pure speculation. The nets of Doggerland have already pulled up worked antler, mammoth bone, and flint tools from a world that disappeared beneath the North Sea. Those finds prove that the seabed can hold the physical memory of a lost human landscape. They are accidental samples from an archive we have barely begun to explore. The ocean floor is not empty. It is a library whose shelves run for millions of square kilometres, and we have only cracked open the first few volumes. Each mud layer, each buried valley, each submerged forest is a page that no one has yet turned. The ink is pollen, stone, and bone. Inside that library may lie the biographies of people history never named. Their camps, their routes, their seasons, their slow adaptation to a changing world. The land sites we have studied for a century are only the dry edges. The main archive is underwater, and it is more vast than all the excavations on land combined. So what does that mean for the way we think about progress? If our story is not a ladder rising from simple to complex, but a shoreline repeatedly redrawn by water, what then? We tend to imagine human history as a ladder. Each rung rises from the one before it. Stone tools, then farming, then cities, then writing, then everything we recognize. The story moves upward, and the visible monuments seem to confirm the climb. A pyramid looks like a higher achievement than a hut. A written law code looks like a step beyond oral memory. This picture is not foolish. It is simply incomplete. But a drowned world forces a different shape into the mind. The sea level rise after the last ice age was not a single event. It was a slow, relentless pressure that lasted for thousands of years. Year by year, the water crept higher. It swallowed the richest coastal plains, the sheltered bays, the river mouths where fresh water and salt water mixed into some of the most productive landscapes on the planet. These were the places where people gathered most densely, and these were the places that disappeared first. The erasure was not dramatic in the moment. A family might notice the shoreline moving closer to their camp season after season. A generation might remember fishing grounds that had turned into open water. Over centuries, whole territories became seabed. The maps changed so gradually that no single person could see the full loss. But the loss was total. The land that vanished under the North Sea was not empty wilderness. It was Doggerland, a country without a name, now remembered only through bones and antler pulled up by fishing nets. The vast Sunda shelf in Southeast Asia was not a chain of islands from the beginning. It was a connected world of rivers and forests that broke apart as the water rose, forcing entire populations to move, to adapt, to carry what they could. What we call civilization, the first cities, the first writing, the first kings, may not be the whole story. It may be the part that happened to survive on higher ground. The evidence we have is not necessarily the first evidence. It is the evidence that was not erased by salt water and sediment. The ruins we study on land are the survivors of a much larger world that we can barely glimpse. The ocean did not select for the most advanced cultures. It selected for elevation. It preserved what sat on hills and plateaus, and it buried everything else. History may not be a ladder, it may be a shoreline, repeatedly redrawn by water. The line between land and sea is never permanent. It moves with the climate, with the ice, with the slow tilt of the planet. Each redrawing erases some stories and preserves others. The page we can read is not the first page ever written. It is the page that the water did not touch, and yet the story did not disappear completely. The fragments that survived, a carved pillar at Göbekli Tepe, a statue from Thonis-Heracleion, a flood myth preserved in old texts. These fragments tell us something important. Memory is fragile, but it is also resilient. When the land vanished, people carried what they could: names, skills, roots, fears, and the image of a world that was no longer there. They built new monuments on high ground. They told stories about the water that had taken everything. Those stories hardened into myth, and the myths outlasted the coastlines that inspired them. Now, let us bring all the traces together one last time. It began with a dark shape on a sonar screen, more than 600 meters below the surface near western Cuba. A geometry that should not be there. A pattern of right angles and block-like forms lying in the abyss, where no human hand was supposed to reach. That single image opened a door. It turned the ocean from empty space into a locked archive, a place where the oldest pages of the human story might still be waiting. And once that door was open, the world beyond it grew larger than any one anomaly. Since then, we have walked across a drowned plain in the North Sea, where fishing nets still pull up mammoth bone and flint tools from a country without a name. We stood on the broken roof of Sundaland, a vast tropical landmass shattered into the islands of Southeast Asia by water that rose for thousands of years. We climbed a hill in Turkey, where carved stone pillars stand older than cities, older than farming, sealed in earth by the very hands that raised them. We watched divers touch the stone faces of Heracleion, a city that vanished so completely that only old texts remembered its name, until the sea returned it statue by statue. And we held an old text in which Plato wrote a date, 9,000 years before his time, that sits strangely close to the end of the Ice Age, when the oceans were swallowing coasts all over the planet. These were not separate curiosities. They were echoes of the same immense event, the great melt that lifted the seas by more than 100 meters. The slow, relentless redrawing of every shoreline on Earth. The same process took a plain in Europe, a subcontinent in Asia, a hill of memory in Anatolia, and a port city at the mouth of the Nile. It scattered fragments across the seabed and left survivors to carry what they could remember into stone, into story, into myth. The same story kept rising from different water. No single trace can prove a lost civilization beneath the waves. A sonar pattern in the deep, a carved pillar on a hill, a drowned statue, an old text, a flood memory carried for millennia. None of these alone is enough. But a chain of traces, each one a splinter of a larger world, makes the simple version of history harder to keep. The pattern itself becomes the evidence, not a single ruin, but a network of echoes that converge on the same quiet thought. And so the journey ends where it began, not with a final answer, but with the sea at night, holding the first chapter. Picture a dark shoreline. The waves break gently, one after another, under a night sky full of stars. The water stretches out black and silver until it meets the horizon and becomes indistinguishable from the night itself. That water is not empty. It is a lid. Beneath it lies a world that was once as real as the ground beneath your feet. Valleys, rivers, hills, campsites, gathering places, roots that connected families for thousands of years. All of it now resting under a weight of water and sediment, silent and unseen. We began this journey with a question. What if the first civilization was not found because we have been looking on the wrong surface of the planet? What if the oldest human chapter is not buried in some desert or hidden in a cave, but lying under the oceans that rose after the Ice Age? That question took us deep. We saw sonar shapes off Cuba, geometry in the abyss that should not be there. We walked the drowned plains of Doggerland, where fishing nets still pull up bone and antler from a country without a name. We stood on the broken roof of Sundaland, a tropical world shattered into islands by the same rising water. We climbed the carved hill of Göbekli Tepe, a monument that feels like a memorial at the edge of a vanished age. We dove into the muddy waters of Khambhat and the clear currents of Yonaguni, where stone refuses to look ordinary. We touched the statues of Heracleion, a city that disappeared so completely that only old texts remembered its name, until divers found the stone faces waiting in the dark. And we listened to old stories, the sea peoples, Plato's Atlantis, flood traditions that keep the same terror alive across different cultures. All of these traces point in one direction. The human story did not begin on the dry land we see today. It began along coastlines that are now gone. The first page was not written on clay tablets in Sumer. It was lived on shores that the sea later swallowed. We have followed the evidence as far as we can in this journey. The picture is not complete. It may never be complete. The ocean does not give up its secrets easily. It is hard to read. It returns fragments, splinters, echoes. But those fragments are enough to change the way we see the past. The water did not erase everything. It only made the first chapter harder to reach. And perhaps that is enough for now. The past is not solved. It is only partly surfaced. And that is a strangely satisfying place to stop. Not with a final answer, but with a clearer question. Not with the mystery closed, but with the mystery held open gently. Like a book whose first pages are still stuck together by salt and time. The shoreline is not the edge of the world. It is the edge of what we have learned to read. Beyond it, under the waves, lies a deeper story. And maybe, one day, we will find a way to bring more of it back into the light. But for tonight, the sea keeps its silence, the waves keep their rhythm, and the first chapter waits just below the surface under a dark and endless sky.